5, 4. Go.
Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you all to this night's program. This is the last program of the season. I'm Wes Ganaway, Whatcom County Historical Society President, and I'm glad you're all tuned in tonight. A couple of items. The Society has now moved back into their office in the old brick courthouse building on East Street, and so we're looking pretty good there. We have some other programs coming up in the fall, starting in October. But this tonight is one of our favorites. It's Brian Griffin, and he's going to talk about his favorite, J.J. Donovan. So, welcome, Brian.
Wes, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back in museum property. Although you're seeing the picture of the old City Hall, we're producing this from the light catcher, and my friend Drew Watley, the Whatcom Museum's electronic guru and computer guy, is going to help me, going to bring out some photographs, and I'm going to tell you about my latest book, the Donovan Diaries. So here's the book, and the book is really the culmination of an 8-year journey that I have had, an amazing journey of historic research and good luck and fascinating experiences. It all started 8 years ago in 2013. Why don't I take this mask off? You might be able to hear me better. And hopefully being able to take the mask off in the light catcher means that the museum is opening again a bit, and we're going to be able to get back to a normal life. By the way, I heard just today from Althea Harris that we're going to be having the Sunset History Cruises again this summer. So I'm delighted to hear about that, and I look forward to doing the narration, or part of the narration on those history cruises. At any rate, 8 years ago, 2013, I got a phone call early in the year from Byron Mannering, who is the executive director of the Bridget Collins House, that fine social group, social organization that cares for families and children. Bridget Collins, Byron said, no one in the employ of Bridget Collins knows who Bridget Collins was. And he asked me if I would do an oral history and do a digital oral history of the life of Bridget Collins. Well, I knew Bridget Collins, as many of you did. She was a nun who was one of the principal operators of St. Joseph's Hospital. In fact, Bridget was the superintendent of the new hospital when it was built back in, 65? At any rate, she was a wonderful woman who had spent most of her career caring for particularly children, and she was one of the founders of the organization that became the Bridget Collins House. And tragically, she died unexpectedly just several weeks before the organization opened for business. So they named it after her. But nobody who worked there in 2013 knew who Bridget Collins was. So I was delighted to take on the challenge. With the help of Neely Nelson, a fellow historian of mine, a friend of mine, we knew that Bridget Collins had immigrated from Ireland. And Neely found the manifest of the ship that she immigrated on. And the manifest listed 8 or 10, I think there were 12, young Irish girls who were coming to New Jersey to become nuns in the order of the St. Joseph's of Peace order, which was headquartered in New Jersey. One of those names on that list, in addition to Bridget, who was age 15, by the way, was an Ellen Caldwell. Well, I kind of remembered that there was an Sister Ellen who was prominent at St. Joseph's Hospital for many, many years. And so I made some inquiries, and I learned that indeed the Sister Ellen that I knew was Ellen Caldwell, and that she was still living. She was aged 90, and she was living at St. Mary's on the Lake, a convent in Bellevue, near Seattle, on Lake Washington. And it was the retirement home for nuns for the Sisters of St. Joseph's of Peace. So immediately I wanted to interview her. And I got in my car and drove to Bellevue, and I walked through the grounds of the convent, and there framed by some lovely cedar trees was a beautiful white marble statue of St. Joseph and the baby Jesus. And here we are. This statue looked familiar to me. It's a lovely statue, and I thought, I've seen that before. It kind of looks like the statue that I remember that always stood over the entrance of the old St. Joseph's Hospital when it was on State Street. So at any rate, I took a picture of it with my cell phone and went in and interviewed Ellen Caldwell, came back home, and I did a little research, and I quickly learned that the statue that had stood over the entrance to the hospital in Bellingham had been given in 1928 to the hospital by J.J. Donovan, one of my historical heroes in this community. At any rate, I completed the history of Bridget Collins and put it all on CD. And about 2 months later, I had completed that job, and I went back to St. Mary's on the Lake to show the video to the nuns. And this time, as I walked past the statue, I stopped there and I cleared away the leaves and the stuff that was behind the statue, and I saw this. That says, "Gift of J.J. Donovan." It was incised on the bottom, on the base of the statue. It was an electric moment. J.J. Donovan, this was in fact the statue that all my life had stood at the old St. Joseph's Hospital in Bellingham, given by Donovan to the hospital in his community. And I just said, by golly, I'm going to get that statue back to Bellingham. So I came back home and thought, how in the world am I going to convince the nuns to give that statue back? And I got a bright idea. That statue would make a wonderful centerpiece for an exhibit about the life of J.J. Donovan. So I wrote up a little proposal, and I went to Patty Leach, the director of the Whatcom Museum, the great building behind me. And Patty thought it was a great idea to have an exhibition on the life of J.J. Donovan, and agreed to do that. And I didn't really expect it, but she appointed me as curator. So all of a sudden, I had a big job that I really hadn't anticipated. But I was able to go now to the nuns and say, look, we really want that statue for the exhibition that's going to be in the museum. It's part of the community history. The other thing I wanted to do was contact members of the family there were at that time no Donovans, no descendants of the Donovan living in Bellingham. So we began looking for family members because now all of a sudden we had a twofold reason to do so. We needed things to put into the exhibition, and we needed to learn more about Donovan's background, but we also needed those family members to write to the nuns in Bellevue and say, give us back our statue. Well, we found that there were 2 grandchildren of J.J. Donovan still alive. One of them was Patricia Plim, who was 90, and the other one was Donovan Craven, a grandson who lived in New York. And my wife and I happened to be headed to Washington, D.C. on a tourist trip, and I made a contact with Donovan and called him, and he had a few things that he thought would be good to show in the exhibition, and he would be willing to loan them. And so I made an appointment to meet with him in New York. And just before I left on the airplane, I thought maybe I better call the old guy and make sure that our date was still on. I called him and he said, good that you called. Just last night my wife called a niece in New Mexico, excuse me, and she has lots of things that would be good for the exhibition. Well, when I got to Washington, D.C., I called Kathy Riggs in New Mexico. And in fact, she did have lots of things, silver settings and interesting stuff. But she said, my father, who lives in New York, really has the good stuff. So when I called Albert Riggs. Albert lived on Long Island and in Sag Harbor in an old historic house on Captain's Row. And he had in his basement an old chest, a trunk that Donovan's daughter had filled with family memorabilia when J.J. was in his dying weeks. She had come out from Chicago to be with him, and apparently she filled this old trunk with all these wonderful family documents. And Albert Riggs, I was representing the Whatcom Museum, and Albert Riggs was willing to give all of that historic treasure to the Whatcom Museum. And we made a date to meet a few days later, and he brought much of it to me, and I was able to ship it back. Later on, he shipped more and more of it. Ultimately, we ended up with 7 large FedEx boxes filled with 2,000 personal letters, 1,000 business letters, some of these going back to the 1870s, all wound up, wrapped up in decaying, yellowing string with 1 cent and 2 cent stamps still on them, in perfect condition, thousands of photographs, and the best, 42 of J.J. Donovan's diaries. Donovan started writing diaries when he was 14 years old, and he wrote an annual diary almost every day for the rest of his life. And we ended up with 42 of them, an incredible treasure. So the exhibition to be done in the Old City Hall was called Treasures from the Trunk. And there you see the entrance. Many of you, no doubt, went to that exhibition. We had 2 of the rooms there. And there's J.J. is right over my head here, a great picture of him. And you can see, and there is the statue. We got it back. we not only got it back, but the nuns then agreed that we could keep it forever and send it back to St. Joseph's Hospital where it could be, where it should be. At any rate, the exhibition lasted for 11 months, and during the process of the exhibition, it occurred to me that Donovan was surely as important, or probably quite a bit more important, than Dirty Dan Harris in Fairhaven. And so we ought to have a statue of him sitting on a bench in Fairhaven. So we contacted Bob McDermott, the guy who did the Dirty Dan statue for Fairhaven, and he began to work. We raised much of the money by selling pavers in the Fairhaven Village Green. There's a paver from the Koch family. Statues, bronze statues on benches are very expensive. My memory tells me that statue cost $35,000. But we raised all kinds of money by selling large stones like that in the green, and also names on the smaller red pavers. And on each one that contributed money to that Donovan statue, which now stands on the corner of 11th, are the initials JJD. So as you wander Fairhaven Village Green, you know that particular, that was sold to fund this statue. So here's Bob McDermott working. This is his model. This is in clay, if you can imagine. And of course, in this case, poor old JJ doesn't have a head, but he's writing a letter to his wife Clara, and the next picture will show you, I think, the head. There it is. He's got a little pipe sticking out of his dome, but Bob McDermott is a wonderful sculptor, and I think he did a terrific job. And we had a lot of photographs of Donovan for him to look at, and I think he got Donovan very well here. That is what J.J. Donovan looked like. So, meanwhile, we had, we got all kinds of good things to use in the exhibition, but more importantly, or at least as importantly, I wanted to read all of those diaries and all of those personal letters and all of those business letters and record the story of his life. So my friend Gail Helgo, who, as many of you know, is an excellent historian as well, agreed to come up, and every morning for almost a year, Gail and I would sit in my library and read letters, and I would annotate what we felt were the important things. And I ended up with so much information and such an understanding of his personal feelings and his emotions and his experiences and his ups and downs and his that I really felt I had to write his biography. I really think that J.J. Donovan was the most important man in Bellingham's history and was surely worthy of that. And so I committed to writing his biography. But there was almost nothing known about the beginnings of the Donovan family in Ireland. The only thing we knew was one page in an old family Bible, which indicated that J.J.'s grandfather, Dennis Donovan, had been born in 1806 in Skibbereen, Ireland, and had married a woman named Julia, and they'd had 12 children, 11 of whom survived, and we had the names of the children and then the dates of their birth. And that was it. We didn't know what Dennis Donovan did for a living. We didn't know anything about their economic status, their educational status. So the solution was, the answer was, go to Ireland and see if you can find out. Well, I got lucky. I got on an airplane and I flew to Ireland, and I learned that Skibbereen, where we assumed he had been, had come from, was one of the worst hit towns in the Irish potato famine, and that they had a small museum, a heritage museum they called it, dedicated to the story of the potato famine, and they had a historian there who would help with family histories. Very fortunate. So I made a date with Margaret Murphy online to meet her and spend an hour with her on a Saturday morning in October of 2016, I guess. And I flew to Ireland. Margaret Murphy was wonderful. I had an hour's appointment, but I met her at 10 o'clock, and I was with her until 3 o'clock that afternoon while she researched, worked her computers. Ultimately, she was able to tell me, she was able to find the family and tell me where they lived. And then in an act of wonderful generosity, she said, if you'll come back on my day off, Saturday, I'll take you to the place where the 1 acre that the Donovan family rented and lived, and I'll take you to the graveyard where Dennis and Julia are surely buried. So I had a wonderful experience. Here we are at the Kilmacabee graveyard. There were Donovans all over that graveyard, not all related directly to my Donovan. She told me there were 6 Dennis Donovans living in the parish, and so Donovan is a very common name in that particular part of Ireland. But every one of those tombstones is a tombstone of a Donovan. At any rate, so I began writing the book in the hotel in Skibbereen, and a number of years later, finally got it done. Well, I'm not going to tell you all the story of the book. I want you to read it. The book, by the way, is available at the Lightcatcher gift shop and at Village Books. Or you can call me and come to my house and get one if you like. But the book is more than a history book. The book is the story of a wonderful man and his life, and it tells a great deal about national history. He met General Grant, President Grant, and well, it goes on and on. I need to go back and tell you that the potato famine, which was so terrible in the 1845, 50, 60, drove 9 of the Donovan children out of Ireland. The first to come was Peter Donovan in 1848, and he came to New Hampshire, got a job on the railroad, saved his money, sent it back to Ireland, so that 2 years later, Patrick Donovan and his sister Margaret arrived in 1850. And Patrick Donovan was the father of J.J. Donovan. Patrick also got a job on the railroad, and they both became foremen. They were both intelligent people. Interestingly, however, the plight of the native Irish in Ireland was so bad They didn't own land, they had to rent land. Dennis Donovan and his wife raised that family on 1 acre of land that they rented from an English overlord. And they lived on potatoes. I learned that the human being can survive on nothing but potatoes. Potatoes are that nutrient, powerfully nutrient. So they were very poor. When the potatoes were no longer available, they were all starving. 30% of the population of the Skibbereen Parish died of starvation. 30%. 1 million Irishmen died of starvation. Another 1 million immigrated to other countries, most to the United States. It's a horrible story, which I start the book with, really. So Patrick arrived in 1850. He married another Julia. His mother's name was Julia. He married a Julia O'Sullivan. And they had their first child was born in 1858, and that was John Joseph J.J. Donovan. So his letters and his diaries tell the story of a wonderful childhood on a little farm near Plymouth, New Hampshire, raising goats and hunting and berry picking and working hard in the family vegetable garden and being a very good student. In fact, he went to the Plymouth Normal School. You know that Western Washington University used to be a normal school. École normale, a French term which was applied to colleges which were dedicated to teaching teachers. And you can't teach teachers if they don't have kids to practice on, so normal schools were developed for grade schools for teachers to learn how to teach in. I went to the normal school here at Western. J.J. went to the normal school in Plymouth, one of the earliest normal schools in America. And when he was about 15, he met a girl nicknamed Nikki. Her real name was Clara Nichols. And Nikki was a Congregationalist, a staunch Congregationalist, a gal of Puritan descent whose family had come to America in the 1620s, 1630s, and who had been prominent in several government positions in New Hampshire and Connecticut. So here was this Puritan girl and an Irish Catholic, son of an immigrant, an illiterate immigrant, as most of those poor Irish people were, and they were in love. And so there's a love story that runs through this book that's really touching and interesting and fun. And J.J., well, J.J. was so much more than an industrialist and an engineer and a railroad builder and a lumberman. He was also a warm, romantic, poetic Irish guy with who loved people and had a wonderful sense of humor. He was a rich, he had a rich character and he was highly ethical. His passions and his decency and his ethical code are what truly made him the great man that he was. It took 13 years for these two young lovers to finally get over their economic and social differences and marry. And it's quite a story. J.J. wrote poetry to his wife. The anguished letters that go from both directions were all in the trunk, and were educating me about their lives. It's incredible. The Donovans must have saved every piece of paper that ever crossed their threshold, because it was truly revealing to read all of this. So the book is much more than a history book. It's the in-depth story of a man and his life, and as told by him and those who loved him. And it was all made possible by what was found in that trunk and the discovery of the statue of St. Joseph on the grounds of a convent in Bellevue so many years ago. And I'm so delighted to be able to tell you that that statue now stands at the entrance to our new present St. Joseph's Hospital, and it will be there forever and ever. And inscribed in the stone below it are the words that J.J. Dictated, and it is dedicated to two little grandsons of J.J. Donovan and Clara, who died in early childhood. So when you next go by the hospital, be sure to stop in front of that lovely statue and think of J.J. And I hope that you will take a look at this book. There's a picture of Donovan himself. I hope you'll get to know him better. I think I've done him justice with this book. I'm very pleased with it and think you will enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was a half an hour.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah,
I think
you're
that was
doing
all
good.
right.
All right, well, I think we had a really good talk tonight, and I want to thank everybody for coming and viewing. I especially want to thank Drew Watley for his efforts to guide us through this. And hopefully that by this fall we'll be able to meet back in the Rotunda room in the old museum again. And so that's it until October. So thank everyone, and we'll see you then.
Good night.
Good night.
I didn't know we were still on.
It's all right.